Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is
or
January
just
13th.
morning. I don't know that good is applicable anymore.
Mediocre morning to you all.
Yes. Top of the day. Whatever.
So this is episode 154 of transmission, and it's January 13th, 2021. And I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Dan Wolpert. I direct Mike at the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And we're, I think we started with coup week last week. I think we should have started with coup month. I think January is just kind of coup month. So we're sort of in this weird calm before the storm period when who the hell knows what's happening in the little fascist dens all over the country.
Well, they could still go out with a whimper. Like, I want to hope for that, but it's terrifying. Like, because the FBI, and fuck the FBI, but still, if they say, hey, there's people in every state planning on doing the same dealio in state capitals, so watch it, I'm still going to take that with some seriousness.
Yeah.
Because it's terrifying, and it's also plausible. Like, I grew up in rural Minnesota, and even back in the day, like during Bush's years, Bush Senior, there were militias in rural Minnesota. Every rural part of the country has militias in it, and they all go to church, and they all talk about God and country, and they've been there this whole time. And now they've been inflamed, and they're just scarier than even they were when I was a kid.
Yeah, when I was in graduate school in the mid 80s in Colorado, one of my best friends grew up on the western slope of Colorado. It's very rural canyon land area.
It's right in
and
militia country right there.
Yeah, and I went out with him he wanted to take me to his hometown and kind of look around the area. And so we were driving down this road, and again, you got to imagine this very canyony country, and very much, you couldn't see very far into these little places. And so there'd be these dirt roads going off of this main road, and each one went into one of these canyons. We'd go by each one, and he'd be like, okay, that's the right-wing armed militia up that canyon. And we drive a little farther down. He said, okay, that's the church that sexually abuses kids up that canyon. You go on the next one. Okay, that's the so-and-so cult that's up that canyon. It was, and for him, it was just like, this is just normal. I mean, this is what we grew up with, and this is what's going on here. And it was pretty crazy.
And so it'd be great if we were just talking about people who took their fringe groups to rural outposts to live a quiet life for themselves in their strange way, which is problematic enough. But this is mainstream crap now.
Yeah.
The issue is this has been around for a while, and it's totally burst into the center of the mainstream, such that we've had a president, and now, today we're talking about Josh Hawley, the esteemed senator from Missouri.
Yes. Kathleen's great senator.
Yeah, so basically there's this New York Times, you can unpack it, but it's riffing off of an interview I think he did with Christianity Today, which for those a lot of you mainliners might not know about that, but it's like the Christian Century for everyone else. So it's probably the premier evangelical magazine that is respectable. I mean, this isn't a fringe thing. It's kind of the middle of the road.
Very evangelical. Yeah. Yeah, so this New York Times article, and I put a link up to it on Mark's Facebook page post for this episode. So if you want to find that, you can go there and read the whole thing.
It's behind
But
a
to me,
paywall, so you might have to open it in
right,
incognito to be able to read it.
yeah, yeah. But to me, as a public theologian, this is a very fascinating article because it reveals how important theology and historical theology actually is, even though we want to pretend that maybe it's not. Because number two, these people who have an incredible amount of power in our society are thinking about these things. And so the theology that's talked about in here is this completely bizarre, twisted perversion of a very famous theological story, which is the late 4th, early 5th century debate between Pelagius and Augustine about the nature of sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and there's a lot of subtlety to this, but the way it generally gets played out is Augustine, excuse me, had this idea that, sin was innate in all of us, that we just had it. This has led to the idea that has been termed original sin. Whereas Pelagius felt that sin was more of a choice related to the fact that we could, engage in our spiritual lives and receive grace and become better people.
Mm-hmm.
So, fast forward almost 1700 years and so Hawley and his crew are using Pelagius. Just a second.
So I'm just to insert this, because I always want to point this out when people are talking about Pelagius, as Dan drinks water to quench his parched throat. All we really know about Pelagius is the stuff that that's still in print, that's written against him. So any of the nuances of the argument have kind of been lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so these guys aren't even addressing any nuance of any argument.
There's no nuance. They're using him as sort of easy
foil. So they're using him as this foil and poster child for postmodern pluralism,
which is bizarre. Oh my God.
So bizarre and hilarious. And basically saying that the argument between Pelagius and Augustine was about whether you could just do your own thing or whether you need to adhere to church doctrine.
Yeah.
Which had nothing to do with any of their argument. So, first of all, in the 4th century, there basically wasn't any church doctrine.
Not in a centralized, formal way, not really in any depth yet. It was kind of more localized.
So they couldn't be arguing about something that didn't exist. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Augustine, so neither of these people had any sense or idea that one should just do whatever one wanted in life. Right?
Especially Pelagius, because you're accountable for every action and choice that you make yourself.
Yeah. And he was a monk living under a rule that told him what to do basically every minute of the day. So, and then beyond that, Augustine's sense of empire, it was very clear that, in fact, arising from the notion of original sin, because no one could get away from this, human empire by its nature was always corrupt. And so if you read The City of God, which is a pretty long read, most people don't read the whole thing. He's very clear about it. It's a very anti-imperial text. And so he would be absolutely appalled at the idea that senators and secretaries of state, Mike Pompeo's in on this, that all these people would be advocating for the fact that they could somehow run a perfectly good Christian human empire. I mean, Augustine would think that was totally stupid. And so, yeah, so this is a wonderful way that, again, in a modern era, you can take these different arguments, and if you don't really engage them deeply and thoughtfully, you can come up with some pretty twisted stuff. But how many times in the church are we having these kinds of serious reflections and conversations? And how many times are we really engaging these things very deeply? And the truth is, not very often.
This brings up, I grew up with the big bad. Communism is one of the big bads, but so is secularism. And so this is one of the focal points of Josh Hawley's critique. And somehow Pelagius is like he kind of lumps them in together. But so secularism is the big bad because as a good Christian, you want every tongue to confess and every knee to bow before Jesus Christ is Lord. Right? And I used to think this way all the time, even when I wasn't really fascist about it. Because as a Christian, most Christians are left with this weird task of having to be supremacist in some way. So you're either an authoritarian supremacist like Josh Hawley, who thinks that every government should be yielded to Jesus Christ formally and that there should be no secularism. But that secularism is a rival theological category that needs to be brought under submission of Christ. Or you're kind of like a soft supremacist where you believe that everyone has to be given the gospel in a non-coercive way, otherwise it doesn't count. But everyone is accountable to whether they do with the pure presentation of the gospel, and if they don't accept it, they go to hell. Both are supremacists. And then, the problem is churches don't think, as you're saying, theologically about this, because those aren't the only two options. And the third option is some sort of like watered down, sad version of pluralism where we have to say everybody is the same and okay. There's other ways of dealing with this. Like you can say, because I don't believe I'm less committed to Jesus Christ than Josh Hawley. Actually, I think I'm more. I think I'm more serious about Jesus than he is. But I also don't believe in hell. And I also think that if you share anything about your faith at all, it has to be purely as a gift. And there should be no coercion in it, right? So, but in his mind, it's just secularism or what he has. And that's the same message that's heard in churches around the country. So it's not, Josh Hawley isn't an aberration. He's the logical extension of how a majority of Christians talk about Jesus in their churches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, and as you're saying, and I think this is really, really important. And this was one of the reasons that I wrote the book, The Collapse of the Three-Story Universe: Christianity in an Age of Science, because even in a nice liberal church, you have this supremacy baked into so many hymns, prayers, the structure of the service, the architecture, the way that the role of the pastor, and so unconsciously you are still delivering that supremacy, whether you like it or not, without consciously engaging that. And so that's where you get this sort of watered down milquetoast Christianity in the liberal church realm, because we have not seriously engaged this on any kind of a large scale.
Just to toss out a
jump
book
into some comments,
because Gus isn't here to suggest books yet. I've mentioned this before, and I've just found out I've been pronouncing Dorothy Sola's name wrong. It's Dorothy Zola because of Europeans and their funny consonant sounds. But she wrote this book called Beyond Mere Obedience. She's also the one who coined the term Christofascism. And it's important for us to start thinking about God in terms that are intrinsically not just non-hierarchical and non-authoritarian, but anti-authoritarian is part of the case she makes. And so I think that's an important piece of this for those who are theology nerds and want to read that. Jan says, good evening from Myanmar. Nice.
Wow,
I love it when people from other societies, like who are looking at our society from outside, looking like, what the hell are they doing here? We're not alone. Becca writes, friends, please remember that an important consideration to civil nonviolent action is live to fight another day. Stay home, stay safe on January 17th. And, like I have friends who I'm sure are going to tend towards engaging, which I think is, personally, I think is part of the tactical toolbox. I would ask that people who engage, make sure you're really serious about it, not doing it from some sort of machismo, let's punch fascists only kind of thing. This is the time when we have to be serious and know that every action we make has consequences. Kathleen writes, there are a bunch of militia people in Northwest Missouri. They are easily able to cross into Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska to avoid prosecution. None of their trucks have license plates. They are very anti-government, and anti-government in the bad way. Not in any of the interesting, sexy ways. Ceres writes, in the context of 5th century, between Pelagius and Augustine is the moderate. Pelagius is the liberationist. I think a case could be made for that. And Saint Jerome is the raging if you were to make modern. Yeah, we always talk about Augustine being some sort of like anti-sex person, which is kind of true, but not like Saint Jerome, who would like go into his cave daily to wrestle against his demons of lust. Sorry, Augustine hated cults and empires. He was a cult survivor who grew up with a father serving the imperial army. That's right. I feel like Augustine gets to be, because he influenced a lot of the reformers like Calvin, and Calvin like is partly responsible for what we have today. I think it's easy just to rip on Augustine. I think he's a little more complex than people.
A lot more.
It's kind of like that old nugget of like any Greek influence at all within the New Testament is bad. I'm like, that's not true either. Hosea writes, have you all discussed Abraham Kuyper and Senator Hawley? No, but like within Calvinist circles of the conservative sort, Kuyper is kind of this sort of perfect example of a prime minister and Calvinist theologian who wanted to bring his society into subordination under Christ. And so he's lifted up as an example of Christ transforming culture, which is just messed up. And so a lot of people that want to influence government for Jesus have a hard-on for Abraham Kuyper.
So you should probably explain who he is.
Yeah, he was I believe he was prime minister of the Netherlands during like the strong Calvinist era. And he is a theologian. So he really wanted to kind of rule the way Calvin ruled Geneva. So It's just this archetype of the Christian ruler that a lot of people in the modern era who are Calvinistic look to as an example. Mark writes, the irony that folks who ostensibly profess that God is the arbiter of salvation, but who believe they are responsible for bringing others to salvation, never ceases to make my brain hurt. I'll leave it at that. That is a very, it's either paradoxical or stupid. I'll let people decide for themselves which way to go with that. Kathleen writes, isn't it true that our founders were mostly deists? I think a lot of them were. I'm not a fan, but it's better than trying to force everyone to share the same view of a personal God.
Yeah. I mean, you don't need to go all the way back to the 4th century to find Americans distorting who people were theologically. The modern evangelical church wants to lift up our founding fathers as like, hand-waving non-denominationalists or something, of which they were nothing of the sort. I mean, Thomas Jefferson created his own Bible. Many of these people thought that Christianity was a crock. A number of them were deists. This idea of God as the cosmic watchmaker, that God makes creation, but then just winds it up and heads to another galaxy to find something better to do. So yeah, I mean the founding fathers were not modern evangelical Christians by any stretch of the imagination.
No. Hosea's posting this link again. Just search for the New York Times, Josh Hawley, Religion, Democracy. If you search those terms, you'll find it for those who want to read it. Susan writes, I had an experience yesterday with a colleague who was essentially evangelizing me on not worrying about current corruption in government, but trusting that God is in control. If I am a woman of faith, I was kind of down about the encounter. I hate that. There's a weird way of like victim blaming.
Yeah.
People like, I can't remember the last time anyone said God is in control, and it's been a positive way of talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and and see, these are all these examples of ways in which theologies are floating around our society and have varying degrees of influence, some of them great degrees of influence. And yet it's very hard to have really, in-depth, nuanced conversations about this. So when somebody says that, God is in control, like, what does that even mean? Right? What does that even mean? Does that mean when the universe experiences heat death and disappears altogether, that God will still be there? Well, okay, fine. How is that relevant to what's happening today? And this notion of like, well, don't worry, be happy, God is in control. What does that do for somebody that's being oppressed and experiencing tremendous suffering, or your society is in the midst of falling apart? I mean, that sounds like some kind of Hallmark card, album. So yeah, I think that this to me is another great example of really bad theology that the church and church leaders and church communities should be spending a lot more time reflecting on and developing people of really much deeper formation. But this is the sort of thing that gets tossed out in church and prayers all the time, and it's largely just stupid at worst and highly abusive at best, or the other way around. Stupid at best and abusive at worst.
Do we have to pick?
It's bad no matter what.
It's bad all the way down. Khan asks, what do we do with the terms Jesus is Lord and King? Isn't that inherently hierarchical? Can we claim that in a non-hierarchical way? I will plug my book now. This is our book plugging hour, I guess.
All right. Well, Gus isn't here to do the library.
Well, she shows up in a bit, but
okay. I'm here. Oh yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I wrote a book called Unkingdom that talks a little bit about this. But I mean, two things that I think are important to keep in mind. One, if you're an oppressed group and you're claiming that your dead founder is a king, it totally means something different than if you're an empire who's claiming to follow the emperor god. Like, it just works different. And we have to recognize that the moment that Christianity gained power and had the capacity to be supremacist, this language of king became subverted from what it was originally meant to be, which is a vindication for oppressed people to say, we follow, we don't follow Caesar, we follow this other king. The other thing is to look at what Jesus did as an example of what he meant by king. Mm-hmm. And that it doesn't change. Like, I don't care what your interpretation of the book of Revelation, if you see it as God coming back and murdering everybody who isn't a true believer, you're reading Revelation wrong. I mean, Jesus, if your definition of king is wearing a crown of thorns and that your throne is a cross, and that your way of being supremacist is to suffer and die at the hands of your oppressors, and that your way of building an army is healing lepers, then by all means, call yourself a king. Like, that's kind of, but like, of course, we're dumb about it. We just kind of just take these words and apply it and say Jesus is at the top of the hierarchical pyramid, and therefore the pyramid is justified. That's kind of what we do all the time, and it's bad.
Yeah, and right. I mean, this is another great example of this kind of issue of language, and Jesus himself never claimed to be a king. So think in many ways applying that term to him is, yeah, I would just assume we didn't do it. And the term Lord within the context of the Bible arises as a result of a really weird translational issue in the Hebrew scripture, and is also very problematic in a lot of ways. So yeah, this is another thing that really needs to be examined, and I think we can be perfectly free to perhaps say, yeah, these terms are no longer viable, and we shouldn't use them.
Yeah. Ellie writes, Kathleen, it is my understanding this is true. I brought this to the attention of a friend who is politically conservative and also a Christian homeschooler. She wasn't even aware of what a deist was, much less that any of the founders were. People only see history, what is confirming of what they want to believe, and church history too. Like, this is kind of what we're pointing out is like, and we all tend to do this. Like, it's not all bad. We all tend to look with our lens to find stuff that supports what we're trying to say. But there's more myopic ways of doing that and self-serving, and there's less myopic and less self-serving ways of doing that. Gus writes, I'm here. I was biding my time to suggest the work of Paul Kivel. I'm reading something from Paul Kivel for my class right now. His stuff on Christian hegemony was a watershed moment for me. Mark's old podcast, the Econocast, did a nice interview with him in episode 56. Self-promotions for me all around. Yeah, that was a good interview.
And great librarian job, Gus. God, the way you get like the numbers of these episodes and everything, it's really very impressive.
I've gotten to spend time with Paul Kivel, and he's also talks about he'll talk about patriarchy. He really is looking at all this stuff from an intersectional perspective, and his stuff on Christian hegemony is very important. Ceres writes, a lot of founding fathers have connections with the occult communities and the Enlightenment communities. Lol. Fundies are delusional as hell on whom the founding fathers were. Yeah, Elias writes, is the star sending on Facebook Live will be the transition to cryptocurrency? Oh, so there's some way, I've seen this, like you can send stars to someone. I don't know what it does. I've never really noticed any benefit. We've got to quit demonizing others, so when harmful people strike, we are aware to it. Love you guys. Good stuff. So yeah, I don't know. If anybody's well informed about the star thing, please feel free to let us know, because I don't know what that does. And hierarchy is to be inverted, power to the oppressed. Yes. To me, that's any language of Jesus as king was a power inversion. It's like a subversion tactic. I mean, when you read through the scriptures, it's kind of, that's how it works. The kingdom is to look upside down. Yep. Catherine writes, a popular narrative I grew up with is that Christianity makes people good. So Christians being put in high positions of power is inherently good, maybe even if they aren't very good Christians. Now I see this theology as sowing seeds of Christofascism. Yep. And Gus is like, Catherine, OMG, yes.
That's how probably in relation to the founders. Yeah. Yeah, and so, I do think that, one of the things that, I've been hearing certainly a lot recently and through the pandemic, we've talked about a lot, what are churches doing during this time? The pandemic has kind of revealed that the only important thing to church communities is getting together in a building on Sunday morning for an hour. To me, all of these examples point to the fact that, public theology in the context of what's going on in the midst of your society and community and empire is really, really important. Right. And why are churches have not been retooling to say we need to become communities of public theology? We need to do a video cast every day and talk about these things. We need to really proclaim what we mean by all of these terms. We need to really analyze and discuss what's going on if we can't meet, let's take a look at our liturgy and say, what part of our liturgy is fascist and authoritarian? And why don't we change that for when we get back together? I mean, there are so many things that the church could be up to right now that it has not been up to. And to me, what this article and a lot of these things point out is that behind closed doors in, $2,000 a plate lunches, these people are talking about these theological things. I mean, it's pretty wild, actually, that, they're getting together and talking about Pelagius, right? And they are engaging these things, and without any kind of public voice that makes any sort of difference or educates people at all, they get the only voice, right? I mean, Hawley gets the New York Times interview and the Christian Century Today interview, and so there's a big vacuum here that can be filled with a lot of activity that we're just kind of missing out on.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It gives you 1 cent per star, and people buy stars with dollars and convert it to stars. So I think we've gotten like 6 cents maybe throughout the run of this. So keep the stars coming, everybody. Behold, I have 7 stars in my hand.
Yeah, I don't even know what you guys are talking about, but that's okay.
It's just a way, like for live stream stuff, instead of giving a thumbs up, you can send a star, and apparently it's a penny a pop. That's really, Facebook can do better. Adam writes, the Jesus take the wheel theology just makes for a lot of horrific auto wrecks. Where's your faith, Adam? Lucas writes, I was in an evangelical Christian cult for 5 years. How can we wrestle with this evangelical cultish ideology? Good question.
That's a big topic. We've talked a lot about spiritual abuse. We could come back to that again, but I mean, the issue of religious trauma is an enormous issue. It's hugely problematic. I wrote a paper that I presented at a medical conference claiming that this is probably the greatest source of PTSD in our country. Yet it's almost completely unrecognized. So this is an enormous issue, and and when you've been traumatized, that creates a worldview that is highly distorted in many ways. And you take these different threads that we've been talking about today, and you incorporate them within your trauma experience, and it's really messy and really, really difficult. And then when it's projected outward, it can be really harmful.
Yeah. Adam writes, Catherine, they're like me. It's great that they're in power. It's also happening a lot across identity, creating so much manipulation and misrepresentation. I mean, there's so much messed up with this idea of Christianity and power. Like there's kind of this mystical, I'm not using that in the good sense of the word, thinking that somehow if you are a Christian, that God is somehow making you better. And this is part of the argument with Pelagius and why it's strange, because Pelagius would be like, that doesn't just automatically happen.
Right.
You have to choose. And it doesn't, Pelagius was also very strong in condemning people who don't, share their wealth with the poor. So he really had this liberation instinct. Like, we have to be accountable for actions, and we can choose to be better people and just and create a better society. Now, I might not agree with all of his theology, but I agree with that. And so for someone to come along and say, if you're a Christian, God gives you the secret sauce, a better way of being human than everybody else. And so you're better able to serve by having authority over other people, is a weird way of thinking. And to me, the first thing I want churches, and it's something churches rarely ever talk about, is what is our theology of authority? It's bizarre to me, like how many evangelicals look to scripture as an authoritative source. And what they mean is they have to interpret it and use it as a set of rules, when Jesus said almost the opposite of that. And when you ask Jesus where's authority, he'd say, hey, if I have a command, it's love each other. And don't worry, when I ascend to my Father, I will send my Holy Spirit, who will guide you to all truth. That should be a strong That's advocating for discernment practices within a church. And Paul talks about discernment practices too, that authority can come from anywhere because there's a lot of gifts in the body. And so you have to listen and discern together. Churches don't do that very often.
No.
Instead, they try to parse out scripture in an authoritative theology and then ask people to submit to it. That's messed up.
Get the right answers.
Yep, get the right answer.
All right.
Best.
Yeah, Catherine, I have the last word here.
Different, but very related. The ideal I grew up with is that a Christian marriage was the only healthy and fulfilling kind, and that a partner strong in his faith would never be abusive. Oh my God.
Yeah.
There's so much toxicity wrapped up in all this, and it's sad.
Yeah, it's sad and painful.
And violent.
I
guess
all right.
Jonathan could have the last word because you haven't commented for a while, and so let you have it.
Hey, Jonathan.
And this will for sure be the last word. I was reading a book on Celtic spirituality a couple of years ago, and it had this funny quote, one of the most delightful ironies surrounding Pelagius's excommunication when he was forced to write pseudonymous, I can never say that word, under a pseudonym, is that he signed much of his work Augustine or Jerome. Under these names, his writings circulated throughout Europe.
There we go.
Well, with that.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Another great day of participation, and we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
As coup month continues.